Joe tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and the traffic light that stubbornly stayed red. The rhythmic honking of cars and the hum of the city buzzed around him. He'd been in this spot countless times, another typical rush hour at the intersection of Main and 4th. His thoughts drifted aimlessly, tired from the routine, when something broke through the monotony. A flash of fur caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just a stray dog, one of many wandering the city streets. But then the dog locked eyes with him, its gaze intense, almost pleading. The animal, medium-sized with a striking brindle coat, trotted up to his taxi, its paws scraping against the door. It barked sharply, breaking through the city noise, its urgency cutting through Joe's usual indifference. Joe, a man with a reputation for a gruff exterior, had a soft spot for animals, though he rarely admitted it. Years ago, he'd taken in a stray cat that had wandered into his garage, but that was long behind him now. This dog, though, was different. There was something in its eyes, something almost human in the way it seemed to beg for attention. Joe felt his heart stir in a way he hadn't expected. Still, he wasn't one to act on impulse. He glanced at the traffic light, then back at the dog, which was now pawing at the door more insistently. It barked again, its gaze shifting from Joe to somewhere down the street, as if urging him to follow. Joe frowned, torn between ignoring the strange animal or seeing where this might lead. A dog acting like this? There had to be a reason. With a heavy sigh, Joe leaned over and cracked the window just enough to get a better look at the dog. "What do you want?" he muttered, knowing full well the animal wouldn't answer. But the dog barked again, jumping up and down with such determination that Joe felt a flicker of curiosity. What could be so important that a dog was acting like this? He glanced down the street, squinting at the fading daylight, but nothing seemed out of place. Yet the dog was adamant. Another bark, followed by a sharp look. Joe's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Was he really considering following a stray dog into who knows where? It sounded ridiculous, but something in him couldn't shake the feeling that the dog knew something he didn't. As the light turned green, Joe felt the familiar push to move on, to get back to his shift. But he hesitated, eyes flicking back to the animal. The dog barked once more, glancing down the street with a kind of urgency that gnawed at Joe's conscience. Against his better judgment, he found his hand on the door handle. Just as he was about to open the door, the dog leaped up, barking furiously now, its gaze locked down the road. Joe's heart skipped a beat. Whatever was happening, the dog wasn't going to let him ignore it. He froze, caught between logic and an undeniable pull to follow the strange animal. The city's cacophony faded into the background as he stared at the dog, a question burning in his mind. What does this dog want from me? Joe had seen his share of street animals over the years, strays, abandoned pets, even feral packs in the rougher parts of town, but none had ever acted like this. Most dogs ran from the noise and chaos of the city, not toward it, certainly not with this kind of intent. His instincts told him to forget it, to drive off, and leave the strange dog to its fate. But something about the way this one stared at him, the quiet desperation in its eyes, tugged at his sense of responsibility. He looked around at the pedestrians shuffling past, their faces buried in their phones or locked in their own worlds. No one else seemed to notice the dog or its strange behavior. It was just him and the animal, as if the rest of the world had faded into the background. Joe sighed again, louder this time, knowing that he was about to do something foolish. "All right," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than the dog. He popped the door open slightly, just enough for the dog to stop barking. Immediately, the dog stepped back, wagging its tail for the first time, though its eyes remained focused and urgent. Joe felt a strange connection to the animal, as though they had made some unspoken agreement. He got out of the taxi, ignoring the impatient honk from the car behind him. The driver leaned out of his window, shouting something Joe couldn't quite make out, but it didn't matter. His attention was fixed on the dog, which had already started moving, trotting down the street and looking back every few steps to make sure Joe was following. Joe shoved his hands into his jacket pockets and started walking, shaking his head. "This better not be some wild goose chase," he muttered, though he knew deep down he wouldn't be able to walk away now. The dog had gotten to him. They made their way down the crowded sidewalk, weaving through pedestrians. Joe noticed how the dog moved with purpose, darting between people with surprising agility. Every now and then, it would glance back at him, as if to make sure he was still coming. Joe's curiosity deepened with every block they passed. Where was this dog leading him? The air around them felt thicker now, the bustling sounds of the city starting to blur as Joe followed the dog into a quieter part of town. It was a neighborhood Joe didn't know well. Narrow streets lined with older buildings, the kind of place people passed through without giving a second thought. The dog led him past a row of shuttered shops, their windows dark and empty. Joe's step slowed. He glanced around, suddenly more aware of how alone they were. What was he doing here, chasing after some stray dog? Yet, the dog never wavered. It kept moving forward, leading Joe deeper into the maze of streets. Joe felt a growing sense of unease, but something about the dog's persistence kept him from turning back. It was like the animal knew exactly where it was going, as if it had a plan. The thought crossed Joe's mind that maybe he was being led into trouble, but he dismissed it almost as quickly as it came. This dog wasn't dangerous. If anything, it seemed to be asking for help. Suddenly, the dog stopped, standing perfectly still in the middle of the street. Its ears perked up, and it turned to look at Joe, eyes wide with an emotion Joe couldn't quite place. He stopped too, heart pounding now. The dog let out a low whine, barely audible above the distant hum of the city. Joe took a cautious step forward, unsure of what to do next. Before he could make a decision, the dog barked again, more urgently this time, and bolted down a narrow alleyway. Joe stood frozen for a second, watching as the dog disappeared into the shadows. His mind raced. He could turn around now, go back to his taxi, and pretend none of this ever happened. But something inside him pushed him to follow. Taking a deep breath, Joe started running after the dog, his footsteps echoing off the brick walls. The alley was dimly lit, and the air felt cooler here, the sounds of the city muffled as he chased the flicker of fur ahead. He turned a corner, breath coming in short bursts, and found himself in a small courtyard. There, standing in the center, was the dog. Joe stopped short, bending over to catch his breath. The dog stood still, watching him carefully. In the distance, Joe thought he heard something, faint, almost like a cry. He straightened up, straining to listen, but the sound was gone. He looked back at the dog, which had begun to bark again, pacing in tight circles. "What is it, boy?" Joe asked, though he knew the answer wouldn't come. But the dog seemed to be waiting for him, urging him to take the next step. Joe's curiosity was now fully piqued, his sense of logic battling with the strange compulsion to keep following this dog. What had he gotten himself into? Joe's footsteps echoed in the quiet alleyway, the sound out of place in a city that never truly slept. The dog stood ahead of him, pacing with an air of impatience, its tail swishing side to side in anxious rhythm. Joe wiped the sweat from his brow, still unsure why he was following this strange animal, but he couldn't deny the pull to keep going. It felt as though the dog had some purpose, something it needed him to understand. As Joe caught up, the dog darted ahead again, but this time more slowly, allowing Joe to follow without running. They moved through the narrow alley, the brick walls close on either side, casting long shadows as the last rays of the setting sun disappeared. Joe found himself in an unfamiliar part of town, somewhere he wouldn't have chosen to visit. The streets were narrower here, the buildings older, their windows boarded up or dark. "Where are you taking me, buddy?" Joe muttered, half expecting the dog to look back and answer. The dog, however, continued to lead him through the maze of empty streets, its ears pricked and eyes scanning their surroundings as if on high alert. As they passed a row of old, closed-up shops, Joe felt a strange unease settle in. It was the kind of place where you didn't want to linger too long, where the silence was unnerving. There was something off about the stillness here. He glanced around, wondering if he should turn back, but the dog wasn't giving him that choice. It stopped again, looking back at him, its expression more urgent now. Joe sighed heavily, glancing over his shoulder one last time before resigning himself to this odd journey. All right, I'm coming. He picked up his pace, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread creeping up his spine. They turned another corner, and that's when Joe noticed it. A strange smell in the air, faint but distinct. He couldn't quite place it at first, but the further they went, the stronger it became. It was a mix of something rotten and metallic, like the faintest hint of blood. Joe's stomach turned, and he slowed down, suddenly more cautious. The dog, too, seemed more focused now, its body tense, its movements sharper. Joe's mind began to race. What was he getting himself into? Was this dog leading him to trouble? He had heard stories about people getting lured into traps, but a dog? That seemed ridiculous. And yet, here he was, following a stray animal through the backstreets of a city he barely knew. His thoughts drifted to the past, to another time when his life was filled with the presence of animals. His old dog, Max, had been his companion for years before he lost him to illness. Joe had always been a soft touch when it came to strays, ever since he was a kid and found an abandoned kitten in a rain-soaked alley. That kitten had been his first rescue. It had been starving, soaked to the bone, but Joe nursed it back to health. That small act of kindness had sparked a lifelong affinity for animals, though he'd tried to harden himself after losing Max. Since then, he'd avoided getting attached, afraid of the inevitable pain that came when pets left this world. But now, here he was again, following another stray, this time led not by sentiment, but by a strange, undeniable instinct. Maybe he hadn't changed as much as he thought. The dog darted ahead again, disappearing around a corner. Joe cursed under his breath and jogged to catch up. When he rounded the corner, he found himself facing a long, narrow street lined with abandoned warehouses. The streetlights were few and far between, casting eerie, broken shadows across the cracked pavement. Suddenly, the dog stopped in front of one of the buildings. Its fur bristled, and it started barking low and angry. Joe's heart pounded in his chest. He had seen the dog alert before, but this was different. There was something almost protective in its stance now. It paced back and forth in front of a large, rusted metal door, its barking relentless. Joe took a few cautious steps toward the door, his hands still shoved deep in his jacket pockets. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Something was wrong here. Very wrong. What is it? Joe whispered, mostly to himself. The dog growled low in its throat and scratched at the door, glancing back at Joe with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. For the first time since he started following the dog, Joe felt real fear. He didn't know what was behind that door, but every instinct told him it wasn't good. He hesitated, torn between wanting to leave and the strange sense of responsibility the dog had stirred in him. If the animal had brought him here, there had to be a reason. He took a deep breath and reached for the door handle. It was cold and stiff, rusted from years of neglect. Joe pulled hard, and the door groaned in protest, swinging open slowly with a metallic screech. Inside, the air was thick and stifling, heavy with the same rancid smell that had been following them. Joe gagged but stepped inside, the dog at his side now, no longer barking but watching him closely. The warehouse was dark, lit only by slivers of moonlight that managed to sneak through cracks in the walls and ceiling. As Joe's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw piles of debris scattered around, old wooden crates, rusted machinery, and something else that made his heart lurch, a small pile of blankets in the far corner. And then he heard it, faint but unmistakable, a voice. Help. The sound was weak, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a blade. Joe's blood ran cold. He froze for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. The dog barked once, sharply, snapping Joe out of his shock. "Hey, who's there?" Joe called out, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He took a step forward, his eyes straining to see through the shadows. The dog darted ahead, moving toward the pile of blankets, barking again as it reached them. Joe followed, his heart pounding harder with every step. As he drew closer, he saw something he hadn't noticed before, a small hand, pale and still, sticking out from under the pile of blankets. His stomach twisted in knots. "Oh my God," Joe breathed, dropping to his knees beside the blankets. He threw them back, revealing a young girl, no more than 10 years old, curled up on the cold concrete floor. She was covered in dirt, her face streaked with tears, her clothes torn and disheveled. She looked up at Joe with wide, frightened eyes, barely able to keep them open. "Please help," she whispered, her voice hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in days. Joe's mind raced as he knelt beside her. The dog, who had been barking just moments ago, now sat quietly beside the girl, its eyes fixed on Joe, as if waiting for him to do something. The dog had known. It had led him here. "It's okay," Joe said softly, though his hands trembled as he reached for his phone. "I'm gonna get you help." He dialed 911, his voice shaking as he gave the dispatcher the address, urging them to hurry. The girl looked so weak, so fragile, Joe wasn't sure how much time she had left. As he waited for the sirens to come, Joe glanced at the dog, which was now lying protectively beside the girl, its eyes still fixed on him. There was no doubt in his mind now. This dog had saved her life. And in a strange way, it had pulled him out of his own lonely world, too. The sound of distant sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Joe stayed by the girl's side, his mind swirling with disbelief and gratitude. He reached out and gave the dog a gentle pat on the head. "Good boy," he whispered. "You did good." The dog let out a soft whine, and for the first time since this strange journey began, Joe felt a sense of calm wash over him. Whatever had brought them together in this moment, he knew it was something he'd never forget. Joe remained crouched beside the girl, his hand hovering just above her, uncertain of how to comfort someone so fragile. The faint sounds of sirens in the distance were his only reassurance that help was on the way. But time seemed to slow down in the dim, cold warehouse. He glanced at the dog, who hadn't moved an inch since lying down next to the girl, its gaze fixed on Joe, calm and steady, as if to say, "We're almost there." "Hang in there, kid," Joe whispered, his voice cracking from the tension. He wasn't used to situations like this. Sure, he'd handled the chaos of the city for years as a taxi driver. Drunk passengers, fights breaking out on the curb, fender benders, but nothing prepared him for this kind of raw desperation. His thoughts flashed back to Max, his old dog, and the nights he'd spent nursing the old boy when his health started to decline. He remembered the same feeling of helplessness that gnawed at him now, the sense that all he could do was wait and hope. But this wasn't about him. This was about the girl, and this strange dog who had somehow managed to find her and lead him here. Joe's eyes moved from the girl's fragile form to the dog, and something clicked in his mind. This wasn't a coincidence. The way the dog had acted, its persistence, its urgency, this animal wasn't just a random stray. He had seen the way search and rescue dogs behaved on TV or in the news. Could it be? Could this dog have been trained for something like this? As the sirens grew closer, Joe noticed the dog's ears twitch, its body still tense but ready. He was protecting her, Joe realized, staying with the girl until it knew she was safe. Joe reached for his phone to double-check his call for help, but the screen displayed a weak signal. He cursed softly under his breath, knowing how unreliable this part of town could be. Frantically, he shifted his position, holding the phone higher in an attempt to regain the connection. Still no signal. "Come on," Joe muttered, walking toward the warehouse door, hoping to find better reception outside. The dog let out a low whine as he moved, and Joe glanced back, meeting its gaze. "I'll be right back," he promised, though the knot in his stomach told him that time wasn't on their side. He stepped outside, pacing a few feet from the entrance. Finally, a bar of signal popped up, just enough to get his emergency call through. The dispatcher's voice crackled on the other end, confirming that help was indeed on the way, but it would take them a few more minutes. Joe glanced back toward the warehouse, his heart racing faster now. He knew every second mattered. The dog was still inside, pacing protectively around the girl. Joe hurried back in, his heart heavy with the fear that he might have already wasted too much time. The girl hadn't moved, but her faint breathing offered a sliver of hope. Joe knelt beside her again, glancing at the dog. "I made the call. They're coming." The dog sat beside the girl, its eyes unwavering, as if it understood Joe's words. Then, as Joe settled back on his knees, he thought about the way the dog had behaved this entire time. Not like a typical stray, but with purpose. It wasn't just lost or hungry. It had a mission. Joe ran a hand through his hair, the idea that had been gnawing at him finally making sense. The dog had to be trained for this. No ordinary animal would act like this in a crisis. A memory flashed in Joe's mind. Years ago, when he was volunteering at the local shelter after Max had passed away, there had been a program that trained rescue dogs, dogs capable of finding people in dangerous situations. Joe had been fascinated by the idea, though at the time, he didn't think much beyond his own grief. Could this dog be one of those? Could this animal have been part of a rescue team at some point, now lost or abandoned, just like so many others? The dog was too focused, too controlled to be anything else. Joe's heart tightened as he realized that the dog must have had a past, a purpose. He couldn't have been living on the streets forever. Maybe he'd once belonged to a family who'd trained him for rescues, or maybe a team that used animals in emergencies. Joe glanced at the dog again, wondering what kind of life it had before it ended up here, with him, on this strange night. Suddenly, the faintest sound of a voice cut through Joe's thoughts. "Mister." It was so quiet that Joe thought he might have imagined it. But no. Her lips moved again, and this time the word was clearer. "Mister." Joe leaned in, his heart racing. "Yeah, kid, I'm here. You're going to be all right. Help's coming," he said softly, his voice more steady now. The girl's eyes fluttered open, just barely. She looked at him, but then her gaze shifted to the dog, and a small, fragile smile broke across her face. "Max, he found you," she whispered, her voice so faint it barely reached Joe's ears. "Max." Joe looked at the dog, his old dog's name ringing in his ears. "Max," he repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. The girl nodded weakly. "He stayed with me, wouldn't leave." Joe's throat tightened as he stared at the dog, now sitting calmly beside the girl, its intelligent eyes watching them both. This dog, Max, had led him through the maze of city streets, had stayed with this girl through her ordeal, refusing to abandon her. And somehow, the universe had sent this dog, of all creatures, to Joe. The wail of sirens grew louder now, and within moments, the ambulance arrived. Paramedics poured into the warehouse, their voices quick and professional as they assessed the situation. Joe stepped back, giving them space to work, but he couldn't take his eyes off the dog, Max. One of the paramedics lifted the girl onto a stretcher, and the dog trotted beside her, staying close as they wheeled her out. One of the paramedics approached Joe, looking tired but calm. "Sir, you found her." Yeah," Joe replied, his voice shaky. "Well, the dog did. He led me here." The paramedic nodded, glancing down at the dog, now sitting by the stretcher, waiting as if it was part of the rescue team. "Rescue dogs. Sometimes they go missing. You're lucky this one found you," he said, almost as if it were a normal occurrence. Joe blinked, his mind reeling. The paramedic shrugged before turning back to the girl. Joe followed them outside, standing on the curb as the flashing lights of the ambulance painted the street in red and white. The dog paced near the doors of the ambulance, anxious but calm. One of the paramedics stopped just before closing the doors, giving Joe a look. "You coming with us?" Joe blinked. No, but I think the dog should," he said, his voice steady now. The paramedic glanced at the dog, then nodded, lifting it into the ambulance before shutting the doors. Joe watched the ambulance drive away, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The dog, Max, hadn't just saved the girl. He had brought Joe back into the world, reminded him of the connection he'd lost when his old dog passed away. This wasn't just a random encounter. It was fate, in its strange and mysterious way. He leaned against the side of his taxi, letting the city sounds slowly wash over him. It felt different now, less harsh, as if something inside him had shifted. Joe's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, staring at the screen. A message from the hospital. The girl was stable. And the dog still here with her, waiting by her side. Joe let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and smiled. The weight on his shoulders felt lighter now. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of the story with Max. Maybe this was the beginning of something else, something that could fill the void he hadn't realized had been there for years. The days following the rescue were a blur of thoughts and emotions for Joe. He had spent years keeping himself isolated, his world narrowed down to his cab and the passengers who came and went. But now, all he could think about was the dog, Max, and the girl he had helped save. The strange sense of fate, of being pulled into something bigger than his own small life, stayed with him like a shadow. He hadn't heard from the hospital since the night of the rescue. Joe assumed that once the girl was stable, everything would go back to normal for her and for him. But the truth was, nothing felt normal anymore. His mind kept wandering back to the way the dog had looked at him, how it had led him with such determination, how it had refused to leave the girl's side. He felt like he owed the animal something, though he wasn't quite sure what. The hum of the city continued around him, but Joe barely noticed. His thoughts circled endlessly, replaying the events of that night, until finally, he couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. He had to know what happened to the girl and the dog. Joe pulled out his phone and dialed the hospital, fingers shaking slightly as he asked about the girl. He wasn't family, he explained, just someone who'd found her, and he was wondering how she was doing. After a brief hold, a nurse came on the line, her voice calm and reassuring. "The girl is doing much better," the nurse said. "She's recovering, and she's awake now. You did a good thing finding her in time." Joe let out a long breath, relief washing over him. "And the dog?" he asked, his voice quieter now, uncertain if he should even be asking. There was a pause on the other end. "The dog? Oh, you mean the one that was with her?" "Yes, he's still here. He hasn't left her side. It's the strangest thing. He's been sitting outside her room for days waiting. I've never seen anything like it." Joe's heart clenched at the thought of the dog waiting patiently by the girl's door, refusing to leave. "Do you know what's going to happen to him?" "Well," the nurse said slowly, "since he wasn't chipped, we don't have any record of an owner. We've contacted a few animal rescue organizations in the area to see if he was part of any search and rescue groups, but so far nothing. It's a bit of a mystery." Joe thanked her and hung up, the information swirling in his mind. The dog had no home, no one looking for him, and yet it had stayed with the girl out of loyalty. The more Joe thought about it, the more he realized that maybe this dog didn't need to go back to some shelter or rescue group. Maybe it had already found its home. Later that day, Joe found himself standing in the lobby of the hospital, feeling out of place and unsure of what to expect. He had never been good with hospitals. They reminded him too much of the times he had visited Max during his last days. The sterile smell, the beeping machines, the waiting. But this wasn't about him, he reminded himself. He took the elevator up to the pediatric floor, following the directions the nurse had given him. As he stepped out of the elevator, his eyes immediately caught sight of the dog. Max was sitting right outside one of the rooms, just as the nurse had said, his posture calm but alert. As soon as he saw Joe, the dog's tail wagged slowly, a small but unmistakable sign of recognition. "Hey, boy," Joe said softly, kneeling down in front of the dog. Max leaned into Joe's hand as he scratched behind the dog's ears, and for a moment, everything else fell away. There was just him and this dog, a connection that felt deeper than it had any right to be. "You've been looking after her, huh?" Max's eyes, intelligent and steady, seemed to answer for him. A nurse passed by, smiling at Joe and the dog. "He's been right there since she got here," she said, stopping for a moment. "It's like he knows she still needs him." Joe nodded. "And the girl, is she awake?" The nurse's smile softened. "Yes, she's doing better. Would you like to see her? I'm sure she'd like to thank you herself." Joe hesitated. He hadn't come here expecting to meet the girl again. He wasn't sure what he'd say, but something in the way Max sat beside the door, calm and waiting, gave him the courage to nod. "Yeah, okay." The nurse led Joe into the room. The girl was sitting up in bed, her face still pale, but far healthier than when Joe had first seen her. She looked smaller than he remembered, fragile in the oversized hospital gown. Her eyes widened when she saw Joe, and a small smile spread across her face. "You found me," she said softly. Joe cleared his throat, not sure how to respond. "It was the dog," he said. "He's the one who found you. I just followed." The girl looked at Max, who had entered the room and now sat at the foot of her bed, his tail thumping softly against the floor. "I know. Max saved me." Joe felt his throat tighten. "Is that what you call him? Max?" The girl nodded. "That's what I named him when he stayed with me." He didn't leave, not even once. There was a long pause, the kind of quiet that hung in the air when there was nothing more to say, but everything to feel. Joe swallowed hard. The weight of the moment settled into him, the realization that this dog, Max, had brought him here, not just to save the girl, but maybe to save him too. The nurse quietly excused herself, leaving Joe and the girl alone in the room. Joe shifted his feet, unsure of what to do next. The girl looked up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Are you going to keep him?" she asked suddenly, her voice so hopeful that it caught Joe off guard. Joe looked at the dog, then back at the girl. Keep him. The idea seemed so simple, yet it carried so much weight. Max had already shown more loyalty, more heart, than most people Joe knew, and the thought of going back to his quiet, lonely apartment without the dog sitting by his side now seemed impossible. "I guess I could," Joe said, his voice gruff as he tried to hold back the emotion welling up inside him. "If he'll have me." The girl's smile widened, and for the first time, Joe felt a sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't just about saving the girl, or even about what the dog had done. It was about something deeper, about being found, about belonging. Max wasn't just a stray anymore. He was part of something bigger now, part of Joe's life. As Joe stood up to leave, Max followed him to the door, his tail wagging. The girl waved at them both, her small hand trembling slightly, but full of strength. "Thank you," she whispered, and Joe nodded, feeling like he was the one who should be thanking her. Joe and Max stepped out of the hospital and into the cool evening air. The city buzzed around them, but it felt different now. Less lonely, more full of possibilities. Joe looked down at Max, who trotted beside him with an easy confidence, and smiled. "You ready to go home, boy?" Joe asked, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was heading somewhere he belonged to. Max barked softly, as if in agreement, and together they walked down the street, the world stretching out before them, full of second chances.